But I'm going to say it's the top of the hour. Welcome, everyone. My name is Annie Burgess. I'm the lab director here at ESIP, and I'm the room host for this session. I just wanted to send out a couple of reminders to everyone. First, to remember to mute yourself during presentations. Everyone seems pretty well versed in that thus far, but just a friendly reminder. Second, when we're doing question time and having conversation, we'd encourage you to have your camera on if you feel comfortable with that. During presentations, feel free to turn your camera off and focus on the slide deck. A reminder that we do have a community code of conduct. If you haven't checked that out yet, you can do so and find that in the notes document. And lastly, what was my last note? Yeah, it sounds like these guys are going to be capturing questions from the chat. So just familiarize yourself with the Zoom window if you haven't thus far. Find the chat, and that's where you can put comments and questions from the presenters. So if you do have any questions for me, again, please do feel free to add them to chat. And otherwise, I will pass it over to Tom. So take it away, Tom.
Hey, welcome everybody. Thank you for your interest in our session on environment and security analysis. We actually have two back-to-back sessions. This is part one. This will be run as a sort of a typical panel with 3 speakers and a discussion at the end. And then part two, later this afternoon, is much more technical, and we'll have you break out into rooms where you can focus on one of several ongoing efforts and have a more interactive exchange with more technical detail. I also want to thank Josh Brinks, who's worked incredibly hard to organize these 2 sessions, but is muted because he has a sick child at home, and we all feel for his child. Share my screen. Several of us at iSciences actually work in Burlington, so we were quite disappointed when we had to make this a virtual meeting, but we're looking forward to next year. My name is Tom Paris. I'm the president of iSciences, and the folks involved in these 2 sessions have all been working together for a period of time on an effort that we hope will improve, to provide open source tools that will lower the barriers to entry for environment and security analysis. Before I get into the meat of the session, what I'd like you to do is use the chat box and let us know how you think of environment and security analysis and how you defined it. As I tell you a little more about our company's background, we can take a look at what's going on in the chat box and report out on different conceptualizations of environment and security analytics. This is our first time at ESIP. We've been a member of ESIP since 2009, iSciences, but this is the first time we've actually participated in a conference. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time telling you about iSciences. We're a Michigan limited liability company founded in 1997. Our headquarters is in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We have an office in Burlington, Vermont. We have a group of people in Asheville, North Carolina, supporting National Centers for Environmental Information. And we have an employee in Washington State. Our work focuses on 4 practice areas that are highly overlapping and complementary to one another. We've have a long history in doing work on water and climate. We working on monitoring, projecting water stress around the world. We couple that with work on human security, so food, water, energy security, public health, and governance. And as a company, we take advantage of GIS and remote sensing to build global maps of environmental and sustainability indicators. And our corporate sustainability practice uses those maps to put corporate facilities, supply chains, other assets of value onto those maps. We roll that information up and provide strategic analysis to the corporations or the US government to identify emerging hotspots where there's risks that need to be mitigated, or emerging opportunities where there's business opportunities that can be captured. One of the reasons you don't hear much from us in open fora like this is that much of our work is done under non-disclosure agreement. So we're really happy that we have a portfolio of work with generous sponsorship from the Corps of Engineers to develop some open source tools that we'll describe over the course of these two sessions. So actually, Eileen, do you want to try to summarize? I can't see what's going on in the chat box. Do you want to try to summarize some of the ideas that have come into the chat box on environment and security analysis?
Yep, absolutely. One of them was from Brian, who said his definition would be decision analysis for risk mitigation and management. Steve Young offered combined real-time situational analysis and science-based predictions. And Dave Jones is the ability to access trusted data from disparate sources and engage others across any platform in a secure, collaborative way to drive decision-making. And that's what we've got.
Tom, I muted you because we were getting an echo from you, so just unmute.
Okay. Great. So I'm going to spend a few minutes describing how I think of environment and security analysis, and I divide it into two ways of thinking about it. One is framings for environment security analysis, and the other is sort of topical or subject domains for environment security analysis. So in terms of framing environment security, there are a number of complementary and overlapping frames that are used throughout the community. Vulnerability or risk analysis. If you're a pessimist, if you're an optimist, you think about a positive future and sustainability. Resilience is the ability to withstand some sort of shock or stressor. And then various efforts around capacity building, particularly coping capacity and adaptive capacity. And I'll define those in a little more detail on the next slide. In terms of domains, at least for the work that we've done, our customers have a lot of interest in facility security, protecting their facilities from environmental stressors, ranging from water stress to sea level rise to industrial or natural hazards. We do a lot of work with supply chains. There was an interesting article that came across our Twitter feed this morning that the flooding in China is impacting supply chains for personal protective equipment related to COVID. There is a great historic example of flooding in Thailand, shutting down the hard disk drive supply chain for the computer industry. We've done work on cotton supply chain and environmental stresses embedded in the cotton supply chain for large footwear and apparel company. enterprise sustainability, rather than thinking about specific facilities or supply chains or other assets of value, is how do you sustain the enterprise over the long term in the face of changing strategic threats like climate change? I mentioned the various components of human security, food, water, energy, public health, and governance. Those, of course, are all interconnected, and depending on where you sit, you tend to focus on one and then connect to the others. And then at the national security level, we're interested in things like political instability, humanitarian assistance, balance of power, and projection of force types of issues. I find it useful to think of it using a diagram that comes out of the sustainability science literature. And it's useful, I find the diagram useful in a number of ways. One is it emphasizes the number of different disciplinary communities that have to engage with one another when doing environment and security analysis. We're primarily in an earth science community today, so that's the variability and change in environmental systems. Of course, at the same time, there's variability and change in human systems, and those two sets of stresses, those two sets of systems interact with one another over different time frames to produce stresses that impact a place. And the place has a number of characteristics. The first is that different places are sensitive to different types of stresses. So if I'm a once through water-cooled fossil fuel power plant, my sensitivity is to stream flow. If I'm a subsistence rain-fed agricultural producer, my sensitivity is to things like soil moisture and potential evapotranspiration. So the characteristics of the place, how the human system and the environmental system are coupled with one another at that place, help determine the sensitivity of that place to these external stressors. And of course, the place has characteristics. And I talked about the two capacities, coping capacity and adaptive capacity. Coping capacity is the ability to muscle on in the face of these stressors. Adaptive capacity is the ability to reconfigure oneself after things have broken down due to an extreme stressor. And resilience is the ability to reconfigure back to the original configuration. So these three concepts are definitionally different, but when you try to operationalize them, they're very hard to tease apart as to separate, distinct types of attributes of a place. And then, of course, how that place responds to its stresses produces a variety of outcomes. I've listed several here of the bad outcome variety, and that's because most of our work tends to be framed from a vulnerability perspective. So our customers want to avoid the bads. But there are also goods. And so you can think of minimizing the bads and amplifying the goods. Of course, the arrows indicate that this is a highly interactive, recursive system. And not only is it recursive within the confines of this one place, but places are linked with one another across space. So for example, in 2010, when there was an extreme heat wave and drought in Russia, Russia imposed an export embargo on grains that created price spikes in food prices that had negative consequences in import-dependent countries in the Middle East and North Africa, and is at least a contributor to the what we call the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening. So the places are interconnected with one another, as well as in addition to what's pictured on this chart. So again, just the point I'm trying to drive home is that when we think about security analysis, there's human components, there's the environmental systems components that this community spends its lifetime working on, and then there are sort of the social science and human geography pieces that go into how the place is configured, and then the specialized literature associated with each of the outcomes that we either want to mitigate or amplify if they're good. That creates a lot of challenges because people now have to become familiar with data, analytic methodologies, toolkits across multiple disciplines to perform an integrated environment security analysis. It's also important to realize that when we do individual analyses as part of an enterprise doing environment security analysis, that there are a variety of different characteristics of that analysis. Are we doing strategic analysis or tactical analysis? Are we doing global comparative work, or are we focused on the specifics of a given place? Are we looking at chronic conditions, trends, critical thresholds, or episodic conditions, short-term variations from what's expected? And depending on those characteristics of the analysis, that drives one to use different data sets, different toolkits, different methods to perform the analysis. So to summarize, the big challenges are that we have disconnected disciplinary communities, each with their own way of thinking about the issue. The international relations specialist has a very different way of thinking about earth science than the way the earth scientist thinks about international relations. And so that's one of the challenges that we need to overcome. And connecting these disciplinary communities is difficult, and there are a number of barriers to entry. So the first is data discovery and access in unfamiliar disciplines. So ESIP has been working for a long time trying to solve the data discovery and access issues within the earth science community. The environment security community has this problem multiplied because not only do we have to discover what's in the earth science community, but we have to discover and access what's available in these other communities. This is not a new issue for ESIP, but intellectual property in terms of use issues make it difficult to build unified repositories of data. And I'll talk about that a little more about one of the ways we're trying to address that in some of the tools that we've been building together over the past year or so. And then there are issues just getting data from different disciplines to work with one another, different spatial models, polygon versus raster versus point, time series differences, just getting administrative unit codes to line up from one data set to another, particularly when dealing with historic data where things like country boundaries and administrative boundaries change frequently over time. Concept mapping between different disciplines. I don't know how many of you work with fixed effects, random effects methodologies, but depending on which discipline you come from, there's collision in the terminology, and one discipline means one thing with random or fixed effects, and the other discipline means exactly the opposite. And so just sorting out those different concepts can be a challenge. And then, of course, each discipline comes with its own diverse analytic approaches, and trying to figure out how to get those analytic approaches to work with one another. So just,
as you change from 2 minutes.
I'm sorry, Eileen, I did not hear you.
You're at 2 minutes.
Oh, okay, good. So briefly, I want to preview 2 projects that we've been working on with support from the Corps of Engineers. The first is a tool we call Dante, Data Analytics and Tools for Eco-Security. We're doing this in collaboration with Season and Case International. And this is a suite of open source R packages and vignettes designed to help bridge the challenges I just described: data discovery and and access, integration, concept mapping tools. And the trick that we're using to get through the IP terms of use challenges is that we're not providing data directly. We're providing APIs that allow you to acquire the data from the primary source on your own. If that means that you have to, that may mean that you have to sign into those primary source systems and get accounts, but we're only acting as a toolkit, not the actual archiver or distributor of the information. You can see the URLs. There's a website and a GitLab repository. The website right now is a placeholder. We'll be going live with a more complete website in the next month or two. But the GitLab site is there for people to take a look at. The second tool I want to describe is the Water Security Indicator Model. This is a tool we've developed and just recently released as an open source package accessible from the website listed. And it monitors and forecasts water surpluses and deficits worldwide and provides lead times for the forecasts of 1 to 9 months. We produce a monthly report out of the system that we distribute as a public good to all who are interested. And then the tools are available open source to anybody who wants to run them. And in the second session, we'll be talking about a variant of what we do operationally for the monitoring and forecasting to do retrospective climatic adjusted analyses of environmental stresses and related security outcomes. And that's my end.
Thank you, Tom. You may want to mute yourself for a second.
Okay.
See if we get rid of the buzz. Yeah. There are 2 questions that have come in since the last time I interjected. And one of them is related to how you treat climate in the context of environment and security. And I thought I'd ask you that one now. And then I'd like all of our panelists to think about this one because we can bring it up in the discussion. What's the role of environmental justice in environment and security? So let's hold the answers to that one till the discussion, but talk a little bit more about how you treat climate, Tom.
So there are actually, as you might expect, multiple ways to treat climate. So you can treat climate as a long-term trend. Climate change is a long-term trend. To use the obvious example, global mean surface temperatures has a long-term trend, and we have projections about what that will be like in the future. You can look at it as variation around the trend. So you can think of it in terms of episodic stressors, floods, droughts, heat waves, and the like. For those of us in Burlington, we recently had a 6-day heat wave that was not particularly pleasant to live through, but those are becoming more common. And then you can also think about it in terms of critical thresholds. So at some point, an irrigation system, irrigation systems are designed to expand the operating range of agriculture and make it more consistent. But at some point, the environmental stressors can be extreme enough to where that irrigation system breaks down. And so instead of getting a graceful collapse, you get fewer but more severe issues. And so you can think of crossing a critical threshold that way. And of course, if you add variability on top of a long-term trend with critical thresholds, it doesn't take you long to realize that you end up crossing the critical thresholds more frequently. There's a multitude of ways to think about climate and security.
Thanks, Tom. I think we're gonna hold the human security question, but I will point to folks who are following chat. Bob Chen offered some good input on that question, and so Bob, you get to lead off the group discussion with that question when we get there. So I guess we're going to Mark now. Is that right, Tom?
Yes.
All right, great. I'm sharing my screen. Does everyone see it?
Looks
Yeah.
good.
All right, great. Thank you.
Well, Mark,
my name is Mark Wall.
Sorry, Mark. It's in, we can see the slide mode. There we go. Now we can see it in present mode. Great.
Okay, great. So my name is Mark Wall, and I'm a researcher at the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center. I work in the Coastal and Hydraulics Lab. I'll describe a little bit about who we are and what we do in a moment. But I was asked to give an overview of some of the analytic tools that we've been developing through public-private partnerships. So I have a few slides that talk about who we are, what we do, and I'm hoping to provide those will provide some context then to talk briefly about some of these opportunities that we have for partnering. So ERDIC, as we call ourselves, the Engineer Research and Development Center, is a part of the Army Science and Technology Enterprise. This slide just kind of highlights that, and you can see that ERDIC falls under the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We are the research and development function for the Corps of Engineers. And so that has a dual mission, civil works, as well as military engineering. I'll talk about the missionaries a little bit, just again, for the context of who we are and what we do. But there are 7 labs under the ERDIC umbrella. So I want to point that out. I'm with the Coastal and Hydraulics Lab, but we have geospatial research going on, construction engineering research. We do cold regions engineering research. We have an information technology lab, environmental laboratory, geotech and structure. So it's pretty broad engineering base at ERDIC. And it's just, you can see as a percentage of the S&T enterprise funding, ERDIC receives a moderate amount of funding. Certainly a distant second to the combat capabilities development. I mean, that's the Army, big Army and their research and development programs there. The next slide just highlights some of our locations. So these 7 different labs are, there's a cluster of them down in Vicksburg, Mississippi, including the lab that I work for. But we have field offices and laboratories scattered about. That just shows our geographic locations here. And then I want to talk a little bit about these mission areas because that drives everything that we do. We're very mission oriented, being an Army service. So civil works obviously is a large component. A lot of people are familiar with the Corps of Engineers through their civil works. So we have district and division offices all over the country that deal with navigable waterways. There's a regulatory arm associated with that. They manage a lot of flood control operations. They have a vast inventory of infrastructure that they're responsible for maintaining and operating. That's the U.S. domestic side of the Corps of Engineers that a lot of us are probably familiar with. There's also the construction and maintenance of installations, so more of a traditional Army engineer function, as well as the geospatial mapping falls under USACE, or the Corps of Engineers. And we get involved in contingency operations supporting Big Army. And a lot of those include humanitarian assistance and disaster response types of efforts that the Army and DoD responds to. And those can be anywhere in the world, not just limited to the United States. So USACE supports a number of different interagency activities as well. So we interface, especially on these humanitarian assistance disaster response, with federal, state, and local levels. So that's, and then of course, the research and development side of what we do, and that's ERDIC. We've sort of divided we have the 7 different laboratories, but a lot of our efforts are cross-cutting. And so if you had to summarize what our core competencies there are, look at blast and weapons effects. Civil and military engineering is huge. I mentioned the terrain mapping and the cold regions type of work. And then the installations, there's also computational prototyping for military platforms. So running simulations on the high performance computing system prior to building machinery, seeing how it performs. And so environmental characterization is one component of that. And that's one area that I get involved with. And then of course the coastal river environmental engineering aspects, which is very heavy on the coastal and coastal hydraulics lab that I'm with. At this point, are there any questions or concerns about who we are and what ERDIC is? If I can't see the chat box or anything like that, so Elaine, do we have anything to address at this point?
Not at this.
Okay, then I'll just keep plugging along. As a hydrologist with the Coastal Hydraulics Lab, a lot of our R&D involves numerical modeling. So that's related to flood control projects in the U.S. and also for more high-level situational awareness that commanders might need outside the United States within their areas of responsibility. So I would characterize what we do as a lot of environmental characterization that feeds decision support. So a lot of the decision support aspects that Tom was talking about directly have relevance to the Corps of Engineers and where we're going with some of our development activities. One of the capabilities that I wanted to talk, I'm sorry? That was meant for us, or
I think that was just some feedback on
Tom, can you mute?
All right. So I wanted to talk, this is sort of more getting in aligned with the research that I do. So it's a little more in my wheelhouse anyway, is looking at some of the capabilities for near-term or 2-week forecasting, hydrologic forecasts, and applying that globally. So there's definitely some efforts similar to this inside the United States through NOAA and the National Water Center, trying to characterize stream flow, get a handle on flooding, flash flooding, locally based reach by reach assessment of current real-time, near real-time conditions as well as forecasted. So weather-informed hydrology. And so one of the tools that we've been working on in the development aspect is the stream flow prediction tool. I want to highlight Alyssa Yates, my colleague. She's going to be talking in the next session, and she's going to be demonstrating a couple of these capabilities. So I'm not going to go into great detail on all the nuances to these, but I wanted to throw them out there and get people thinking about them, and I think it helps also provide some context. But I was asked to talk about it in terms of private and public partnerships, and so I wanted to point out that this global hydrologic forecasting framework that we've been working on is it's a true partnership, and so it's been built on an open source computational engine developed out of the University of Texas for the stream routing, and it uses a graphical user interface that is built on a platform out of Brigham Young University. And so we've been working with them, and the open source projects make that a whole lot easier when code is open source. And then the second one is more of a seasonal, sub-seasonal forecasting capability, and this feeds directly into some of the work that we've been doing with iSciences and Tom in particular, to get a similar type of online on-demand capability that gives folks a high-level situational awareness around the world and where the water deficits and where the water surpluses are. So potential flooding, potential drought. More impactful though is the second order effects from that. So how does that affect energy loss, energy production, agricultural production, things like that. But this tool provides seasonal outlooks based on a 9-month climate forecast, and it's basically to identify water surpluses and deficits. And this is a computational engine that Tom and Dan Bastian at iSciences have developed, and we've worked with them to make this an open source code. As Tom mentioned, it's now an open source code available to all. And it uses a similar, we've kind of wrapped it in a similar type of user interface that we're using with the stream flow predictions to make this more available online on demand to the DoD. And we're partnering on this with not just iSciences, but the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency is working on a remotely sensed reservoir assessment piece to this. So that's the dots on the map highlighting reservoirs, lakes and reservoirs that are either depleted or excessively full based on seasonal norms. This is something that we're very interested in pulling in and also utilizing in the stream flow prediction. So in the near-term predictions, getting a real-time assessment of how what the capacity of these reservoirs are is going to have a direct impact on how those reservoirs are being operated. And so getting a better understanding of that is important. And then NGA is also interested in this type of work with their partners at Applied Research Labs at University of Texas. They want the data pumped back to them so that they can feed a global geohazard mapping framework that they're working on. And so number of interagency as well as private partnerships going on related to this. Like I mentioned, Alyssa Yates is going to talk about that more. In the remainder of my time, I wanted to talk about some of these opportunities for partnering. You might be familiar with broad agency announcements. These are fairly rigid announcements that give you that solicit either academic or industry solutions for some of the DoD problem sets that are out there. So cutting edge research that's out there and trying to leverage that for a whole of government kind of approach. And so these broad agency announcements are common means for leveraging solutions from both industry and academia. And there are also some small business innovation research and technology transfer mechanisms out there for funding. We particularly like these because this doesn't come out of our research programs necessarily. There's money set aside for these. Are some of the impetus behind this is economic development and supporting small businesses for R&D activities. And so if we can align some of our needs with that program, there's opportunities there as well for small business technologies to either transfer some of the things that we're working on out, or some of the innovations that industry and academics have brought into our government domain. And so these are more placeholder slides. I did post these slides on the agenda so that you see the links down there and you can scan these announcements and things. But I want to also mention that if you've had any experience at all working with these programs, you probably know that they can be somewhat daunting to navigate in this whole federal procurement environment. It's the same for me as a researcher. I certainly don't pretend to know all the ins and outs of contracting. And so I can feel your pain to some extent. And ERDIC recognizes this. And so ERDIC has established a partnership intermediary agreement, a PIA, with a nonprofit called DefenseWorks. And they're basically, this nonprofit functions to basically act as an innovation hub that will be a force multiplier for us in leveraging technologies and outreach of these technologies, trying to create collaboration channels, so facilitating involvement. I've posted the website to erdicworks.org up here. There's a point of contact as well on here. And again, these slides are posted. So I wanted to make that, basically ERDIC Works is to try to help not just researchers, but also industry and academics navigate this procurement process, get connected. So part of it is just simply networking, and they've done some innovative types of, I don't know what you would call them. I call it a bake-off, where it's more or less a contest with prize money, where they will say, we've got this problem, bring your solution off the shelf to this. It will evaluate it, and the best technology, or there'll be some series of down selects to sort of winnow which solutions maybe meet our needs best and things like that. And so they're definitely trying some innovative things that are a little bit more outside of this just straight up broad agency announcement where we list a problem and we wait for people to respond with their solutions, and we try to find a way to fund those. And so I just want to point out that these are just some of the partnerships that it's my last slide here. These are some of the partnerships that ERDIC is involved with. So you can see that we do partner quite extensively, particularly with academia, but also industry partners and internationally as well. We've been working with the UK Met Office on a number of things with this weather-informed hydrology and some of the connections to the Air Force Weather Agency and their models that come through the UK. So that's pretty much the extent of what I had to present, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions at this point, if there are any.
Yep. Yeah, Mark, there are a couple, and then I'll talk about a little bit about how in the chat room the discussion of environmental justice and equity is being broadened. So we'll come back to that later. But there are two specifically for you, Mark, from Dave Jones. First is any of the output from the forecasting models, which I believe is the streamflow forecasting models you talked about, is any of that, are any of those, that output available as web services for public access?
So not at this time, not from the Corps of Engineers, and that gets into some of the politics of whose mission is what. And NOAA and the National Weather Service certainly has that mission in the United States, and so they're the official and authoritative source for this kind of information on U.S. streams and rivers. And so we are very cautious to share that kind of information and conflict with what they're putting out. However, there is an effort to align what we're doing with the National Water Center and river forecasting centers, so that when you look at a prediction, it's not one deterministic prediction, but it's an ensemble-based, multi-model ensemble-based prediction. There's definitely some forecasting that goes on the coastal side of our house. So the Coastal and Hydrologic Lab, half the lab is focused on coastal problem sets and looking at storm surge. And so the Corps definitely advises, particularly with respect to their operations, so the flood walls and floodgates that they operate. There's a lot of communication going on between the different agencies. But as far as, I mean, the blunt answer is no, this information is not available right now for public access. However, we have talked about having a third party disseminate this to the Pacific Disaster Center or some other center on global hydrology, maybe looking at putting our data into that environment so that it can be aggregated and shared. But it's not currently happening. These are also, I want to point out, prototype tools. They are not authoritative at this point for the Army either. And so there's still very much research and development activities at this point.
Great. And I'll come back to Dave's second question in a minute, but Alyssa would like to know a little bit more about why the Army Corps of Engineers has a streamflow prediction mission globally, since you were just saying it's for you. So how and why?
So when we are working with partner nations, as well as when we have contingency operations around the world, we need to understand what the hydrologic conditions. So that's just one small piece of the entire puzzle in terms of what the environmental conditions are like. But if you're traversing a terrain, you want to, one, know where the streams and rivers are. Two, you want to know if they're going to be an impediment to your movement. So whether you can cross the streams with your bridge sets or whether you can ford the streams with your vehicles. What are the hydrologic conditions on the ground today, tomorrow, in the near term, and even looking at the climatology to understand what a typical February looks like in this area. When are the high flows and the low flows and things like that. These are ungauged streams. So obviously if you've got a robust network of stream gauges like we do in the United States, they have a pretty good hand on what the real-time conditions are, and then it's a matter of running forecasting models to understand that. A lot of times we're looking at very data sparse areas. I think that's what's unique about the global, and that's what also differentiates us from some of the work that's going on at NOAA and the Water Center is we are starving for data in the areas that we have to look at. So nobody's sharing with us what the hydrologic flows are, what the historical gauge information. A lot of times that's just not available, period. And so understanding that is key to operating in some of these environments and getting a handle and seeing, say, it's flooding right now in central China, seeing that, knowing Tom mentioned the supply chains and things like that. How is that going to affect this COVID response? And how is that going to affect me in my, commerce in this country that the Corps of Engineers is involved with? And so having a little bit more, instead of being in a reactive posture, trying to understand at a high level where the hydrologic activity is today and what that means in terms of decisions that our leaders need to be making.
Right. Thank you, Mark. That's great. And I would like to mention that Army Corps ERDIC is actually a new member of ESIP. So this is your first conference at representing a partner organization. So glad to have you here, Mark.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
And okay, we'll come back to a couple more questions back at the end, but let's go ahead and move on to Bob Chen.
Great, thanks, Eileen, and nice to be here and see everybody virtually at least. I'm trying to work on my screen here. So as you can tell, we have a program that includes someone from the private sector, someone from the government, and me from, whoops, I didn't mean to do that, academia. And so I'm going to be talking, and given the theme of the overall ESIP meeting, I thought I'd spend my time talking a bit about public-private partnerships from our perspective. Many of you know, Season's been around for over 20 years at Columbia University in New York, which is where I'm normally based if I didn't happen to be sitting in Falmouth, Massachusetts instead of New York at the moment. But Season is a unit of the Earth Institute. One of my hats and the hat that is represented in the ESIP is the NASA Socioeconomic Data and Applications Center. But we're also been working as part of the partnership with iSciences and ERDIC for the last couple of years, and are involved in the tool development and other activities as you'll hear about. But again, I'm going to take a step back and look at the overall issue of public-private partnerships. Sorry, I'll skim through a little bit of, not sure what, this looks cut off for some reason. Here at Columbia and some of our experience in working in different kinds of partnerships, not just with iSciences and the Army Corps. So that actually, I'll start with some early work, which was with iSciences. This was even before we moved to New York from Michigan. And at that point, it's actually when I first started working with Tom. He used to work for the old Season, when Season was a 501c3 based in Michigan. And we supported something called the State Failure Task Force, which later became the Political Instability Task Force. And it was an attempt by the Intel community, I think partly launched by Al Gore, to look at interrelationships between things that cause state failure, including environmental factors, but also demographic change and lots of other things. And he initiated this study that led to kind of an ongoing effort in the Intel community to link with the academic community and kind of tap that expertise to guide thinking about, or strategic thinking of importance to the intelligence community. And that led to some other projects I won't go into. I led something called environmental flashpoints at one point, and then we had this effort with on national security implications of climate and global change. But there have been other public-private partnerships. One we were involved in, which started, among other things, a very long collaboration with a company called ImageCat, was with the global earthquake model, which, if you're familiar with it, still exists, was funded by the risk industry, but also governments, US and Europe, to develop, better and more common interoperable models of earthquake risk. And we worked with ImageCat and others on exposure modeling, and have continued to do that, some with NASA funding, some with World Bank funding. And, because of these partnerships with companies like iSciences and ImageCat, we've kind of engaged in this different models of interaction between the public, private, and academic sectors, trying to produce essentially applied research that goes from the kinds of understandings that come out of the academic community, but that can be useful in both public policy and applied research, applied problems. And then one of our recent collaborations kind of came out of work with Facebook, which has a Data for Good initiative. I'm sure you've run into it, but the Internet.org group quite a few years ago approached the World Bank about developing some high resolution population data, which is open source, open access, and used widely now in humanitarian and other applications. In addition to this, for example, in our NASA work, we actually commissioned work from iSciences. They had actually developed early on really powerful data tools, and in this case, a tool that was a desktop application, and it didn't actually migrate directly to the web, but it was a really nice platform 10 years ago, which could deliver all different kinds of data in a standalone package and promote data integration. And one of the little innovations which you see now in CDAC is, at the time, Terra Viva could support actually not just 4, but lots of linked parallel maps that you could zoom in, zoom out. You could actually change your projections on the fly. It was a really cool tool, but the internet came along, and applications that required a CD to load on your computer weren't all that, didn't really survive the transition. But we do now have several mapping tools that kind of utilize that really nice interface to be able to not just layer data on top of each other, but to see them in parallel and in context. And then just throwing out another example, Dave Jones is on, which is good, because we've been collaborating with him to provide data services from CDAC to his tool, which did come out of a SBIR effort, right, Dave? And so we link into GeoCollaborate. He has a little tool that you can click, and it accesses our server in New York and returns a customized estimate of population that just ties into all the other data that he's pulling into the GeoCollaborate platform. But again, this is a nice, in a sense, collaboration because it's NASA-funded service that we provide, but that groups in the private sector can take advantage of through open standards. And then yet another type of collaboration is one that we started a few years ago. This relates to what I'm sure many of you have seen is the growing number of global scale georeference population and also building human settlement data around the available for the world. And a few years ago, we've been working to create this data collaborative where all the parties, collaborate in making their data more accessible, doing a better job of making the documentation consistent and usable, especially by non-science users, work on ways to let people understand why the data sets are different, what the the most appropriate purpose is for different data, given their pros and cons. So this is a different type of public-private partnership, but and we have gotten support from the foundation world, from the Gates Foundation, to support this kind of interaction and keep it going. There's also participation by different, UN and international organizations like the World Bank and various research institutes, and also a fair number of private companies. And that's led to a website that you can go to called, for the PopGrid Data Collaborative, and a tool that we developed that, for example, lets you compare for any user-defined polygon or circle to kind of see what each different data set says about the population in that area. And as you can see, there can be some significant differences because of the differences in underlying methodology. So just to start wrapping this up, we clearly there's a lot of differences between the different kinds of institutions. Maybe my biased viewpoint, but academics are trying to start with the background science, the larger issues and trends. That's our bread and butter, getting publications out, that sort of thing. Taking it down to the level where it can be used is often difficult. Universities get hung up on intellectual property issues. Academics have the schedule that isn't quite as responsive, perhaps, and specific to user needs. We've run into issues like liability when you're talking about people making decisions on things coming out of a university. Academics get credit for their publications, not even for data sets or helping users make policies. Academics tend not to be very able to take risks, sorry. Private sector organizations, bring the innovation, the connection to stakeholders and the understanding of user needs. Clearly, they are driven by the funding situation and the user requirements, the kind of contracts agreements, often work on shorter time frames. And of course, they have to deal with the fact that there are competitors and others out there. Sorry. And then government entities and other kinds of funders, obviously they sometimes call the shots because they bring the resources, set priorities and requirements. And, but they often have kind of very specific ways in which they can operate. And and therefore some of the flexibility and innovation that can come from the other organizations has to be worked out in a complementary way. And I think, I'm sure everybody here has been involved with different types of partnerships, and ESIP itself and some of the other organizations that have grown up recently are really hybrids that allow the different types of groups to work together. Of course, there are a number of approaches that focus on just making everything open and open source and open access. Of course, that doesn't always work for all the parties involved. That's sort of where the collaboratives can come in, like PopGrid, where you want to take into account some of the constraints that some of the parties have, yet the overall purpose is to increase sharing and interchange. And, Dante is, as Mark and Tom said, kind of coming out of this STTR model of funding from the government. So there's a, that provides a certain structure, but part of the award is to think about sustainability and how it can be continue after the direct support. And, we could talk about this later. It's still not a certain, but, we understand that this type of open access approach needs a lot of community participation to survive. So I think that's it. This recent XKCD thing is just, I thought, nice to look at, because we do want to create tools and data that support this kind of analysis without making stupid mistakes. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay. Great, thanks, Bob. We do have a couple of specific questions for you that we can tackle first and then go back into some broader questions. Cynthia Crowley has asked, could you speak a little bit more about the intellectual property difficulties from the perspective of universities? I expect private industry and government to run into this type of issue much more so than universities. So could you please explain a little bit more?
Yeah, no, Cynthia, that's it's a complicated question, and of course it involves getting lawyers involved who never have a simple, fast solution. So universities are schizophrenic, not that other organizations aren't. So on the one hand, for example, at Columbia, we have a patent office, and lawyers who like to patent or protect the IP produced by the university. Because to give one example, the Earth Institute was started over 20 years ago, partly using the income from some patent that came out of the medical school. And so there's always a part of the university that is, like other organizations, trying to protect IP. At the same time, Columbia has a copyright advisory office in the libraries, which is open, which has helped faculty, for example, at Lamont, establish open access policies, and many of the faculty support this idea of open access and free flow of data and information. So even within the university, there are conflicting views on intellectual property, and I've certainly had a number of cases where a group like the World Bank says, we're funding this, we're the World Bank, we own everything we pay for. Columbia says, we're Columbia, we're one of the leading universities, you're coming to us, we own everything, and you can pay us, but we'll deign to license it to you maybe, but you can't own it. And then they just get stuck in a cycle going back and forth. So this is often a tricky, contentious issue.
Thank you. I think that we could, if you don't mind, Bob, would you mind kicking off the discussion about environmental justice, power politics, the advantaged versus the disadvantaged?
Oh, well, I kind of thought Karen came back and
She did, and she
highlighted in much more detail exactly some of the issues. And you have to think of it in both directions. I mean, I think she's right because, you know, first on the environment side, there is clearly the whole set of justice issues, both in, you know, what's driving climate change and other sorts of variability, and how the impacts play out and who's affected. And on the security side, we have, you know, the inequities that both drive conflict and security problems, you know, displacement of people and so forth, and the impacts of conflict and, you know, other kinds of tensions. And then when you put them together, then you get these bigger issues that are here or coming, like, you know, small island states disappearing and displacing huge populations, and you know, some of the things we're seeing now in terms of differential impacts that could lead to furthering tensions in whatever, South Asia and other places. So yeah, Tom or others may want to chime in on this, but it's clearly a central issue.
Yeah, and in fact, I was going to toss it to Tom because he responded to a follow-on that related to the possibility of a use case study that involves the use of redlining and similar types of approaches to place industrial facilities in areas where there are disadvantaged, particularly Black communities, instead of perhaps using an abandoned shopping mall for some of those facilities. So Tom, you came back to her and told her that yes, in short answer, yes, it is a use case. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so these sorts of distributional issues are really important, obviously, to the people directly involved, and I view that most of the environmental justice work that I've seen is highly localized. Now, there are exceptions where people have done statistical analyses about exposure and asthma rates and things like that. But most of the types of use cases that I've seen in the environmental justice literature are highly localized analyses. I wanted to broaden it because I think of these as larger social processes where, and the question is how they aggregate up to a national scale, sort of, or regional scale politics. And as Bob mentioned, we have a history working on political instability issues. So it turns out that one of the key indicators of risk for nation states falling into large-scale episodes of political instability is a variable on regime type called partial democracy with factionalism. So it has aspects of institutions, democratic institutions, but the nature of the politics is highly divisive, zero-sum game winners and losers types of politics. So if you have these, many of these micro-scale, community-scale environmental justice issues where communities are disempowered to make decisions about their environmental context, that can play into a larger scale political dynamic as it aggregates up nationally. And those processes are where the earth science and the political science and sociology communities really need to engage with one another and start working with one another's data sets and methodologies to understand how these processes scale. Colin Call wrote a great book about environmental politics in Kenya, and his conclusion of that, which it came out of his dissertation actually, was that the environmental stressors on their own are not the big issue. It's how the political leaders in a factionalized environment use those environmental issues and how they disproportionately affect certain communities to strategically create trouble. So those are the sorts of processes where we need to think about what are the environmental stressors, how are they disproportionately affecting communities, and how does that aggregate up to the national or regional political dynamic? I hope that makes sense.
It did to me. I hope it did to others. I'm not sure how to manage this, but I'm wondering if there is anyone else in the room who would like to add to this discussion before we move on to some other questions. And I think there's a way, not sure where to find it, but I think there may be a way for you to raise your hand. And not sure what that, how that.
Yeah, but it's through the participant list, not so much the chat list. So
okay.
It's better just to speak up.
All right. Well, I guess what I'd suggest is that that folks might want to pursue this a little bit more, learn a little bit more about how some of these tools work and how they might be available for some additional studies in this area, particularly in places not just internationally, but places in the United States as well. So I did have a couple of other specific questions for speakers that came up as we were going around. And so one of the questions was from Dave Jones, which was, Mark, can you comment on the status of HURAVAC?
Yeah, I'm not tracking HURAVAC terribly closely. They do have services available. So hurricane evacuation, this is I believe it's closed to government personnel, but not just government personnel, but people who are actively involved with emergency planning and response. So I don't personally have an account with them, so I can't speak directly to that. I can find out. I think I may be eligible for an account, and so I can also explore that option. But I can't adequately answer that right now.
Okay, that's fine. And that was Dave Jones who asked. So when you find out, you can get directly in touch with Dave. There was a little bit of an exchange actually between Dave and Alyssa about that reaches out to the question, what drew the interest of the Army Corps and ERDIC to the idea of being part of ESIP? Would you like to try that one, Mark?
Sure. I think these public-private partnerships are a big part of what we would like to accomplish out of this. And as Alyssa responded to Dave, it looks like there's some discussion here of really trying to understand what some of the opportunities are with ESIP. This is for Alyssa and I, this is our first ESIP meeting, and yeah, we're definitely interested in learning more about how we can leverage this opportunity. And I think that what was discussed here was possibly reaching out to Megan at ESIP to help describe some of this feedback that we're looking for. And Alyssa, did you want to add to that? You've been tracking this discussion.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to add, like Mark said, this is our first real interaction with ESIP. And so thank you to Tom and Dan and Josh on the iSciences side for bringing us in. So I know I have a lot to learn about how the organization works and what the opportunities are, but it sounds like it might be a really good place for us to, grow our research collaborative network. And I mentioned in the chat that one area that we're really grappling with right now is like data and modeling modernization strategies. A lot of core models are legacy models that are kind of siloed. And now as we're trying to produce more interactive models that can work together, be accessed through online portals, we need to step up that online information management strategy. So that might be something that others in ESIP can provide resources to help us with.
Terrific. Thank you. And just, you all heard it. So if you would like to reach out to Alyssa or Mark or both of them with some ideas about that particular issue or in general, working with the Corps on some of these issues. And of course, you're working out with others. I want to point everyone to the chat room. Tom Paris has put up a link to the book that he was talking about in his answer to the question a few minutes ago. It's by Colin. Is that his first name or last name, Tom? You're muted.
Call. His last name is K-A-H-L.
Okay, K-A-H-L. So if you're interested in a little bit more on that, you can reach out. Since the theme of this was public-private partnerships, I'm hoping that, since I don't see any other questions coming in, I would really like each of the speakers to tell all of us what you wish you'd known when you started that you know now about getting into this area, both the public-private partnerships as a tool, but also in environment and security issues. I'm trying to ask you to be a little bit like our friend, Mr. Simpson, and hit your forehead and go, duh, why didn't I know that when I started out? Okay, bad question. Nobody wants to answer.
Yeah, I can start with one thing. And it's not that one of the things that's interesting and complicated is in the security field, how complicated the security community is if you're new to it. We didn't mention this, but and this particular project does not have to deal with classified information, but if you do deal in the security community for any length of time, you run into, the whole world of classified protected information, and that has all sorts of nuances to it, and interesting relationships between the closed world and the open world. And academics, I don't think normally get this at all. I think the government people and others who work in the field understand, and in fact, they like open access in the rest of the world. I mean, the Intel community has long promoted open standards for data because it makes their job easier. They've long promoted, exchange of ideas and things because it benefits everybody, but it particularly benefits them. So, understanding that complexity and kind of getting the players. I mean, there's a civilian intelligence part of the community. There's a military intelligence part of the community. They're not the same, and there are lots of players and things. So it's just a very complicated world if you get involved at all with it.
Tom, did you want to add to that?
Yeah. So I guess I wanted to say a couple things. So you started with public-private partnerships. We're a consulting company, primarily a government contractor. And the nature of how that works is that we've, most, with the exception of a stint in academia, my entire professional career has been spent doing work for hire, meaning people pay me to do work and then they own it. Whether that be commercial clients or government clients, it's sort of the same model. So that business model is very, very different than trying to make a product and repeatedly sell that same product over and over again. It's just a completely different thought process. So what we do is what innovators call bespoke analysis, which is we look at a problem and we tailor a solution to that specific problem. So for us, the open source world has really created a new opportunity for public-private partnerships that span the sort of proprietary interests of individual companies or government agencies where we have to, keep things under wraps because they own the results. And it's created a new business model where we can take work for hire, but that the product is by agreement a shareable product for the community as a whole, whether that be academia, commercial, nonprofit, government. And not all of our work can be like that, but that is really important when dealing with public policy issues because it provides a level of transparency and replicability, and that's something that Josh will talk about in the second session. That is particularly important for government clients and gives commercial clients confidence that the tool has been vetted and looked at by a lot of people, or it sort of died on the vine. So I hope that helps, but that there's always silos that make it difficult, as Bob mentioned, that make it difficult to sort of for free exchange of information between the silos, but we can create open source tools and data sets that help bridge those silos.
Great. Thanks, Tom. And Mark, did you want to add anything to this conversation?
Sure, that's a fascinating question, what you would do differently had you known. I mean, a lot of it does come down to who you know and who's doing what. And if we'd have met Tom sooner, we'd be further down this road, I think, by now. But really what I've come to realize is a lot of our challenges are not necessarily the science so much as the data structures, the data formats. In a lot of cases, what we're talking about doing with running codes and publishing data through web apps and cloud computing and whatnot, in a lot of senses, it's a paradigm shift for us in how we've traditionally disseminated things. We've often written code and disseminated as an executable that you download and the expert takes it and uses it and applies it in a very specific way. That's all fine and good for certain applications, but when you're talking about military folks, these are not hydrologists. They don't, again, this environmental characterization that we're doing is only a small piece in their decision matrix, and so putting it in a format that is accessible and comprehensible is extremely daunting sometimes. And these tech transition hurdles are a big bugaboo for us. Is we can develop a prototype or a capability, but then this is more on the government military side, is getting the requirements and the sustainment funding to support some of this. A lot of the thinking is based on what's already out there and available, and so when you come out with something that's kind of completely new, these knowledge products, for example, they don't fit the procurement pipeline very easily. It's not like you can just specify a concrete mix and have people go out and replicate that and sell it. The knowledge products are a lot more, they just don't fit that acquisition pipeline very well. And so that's a big challenge for us in transitioning these technologies so that they're a fielded capability that folks can then rely on. And so bridging that gap is, I think, still, I can't say that I've figured that out completely, but we are making some serious headway now.
Thank you, Mark. That was actually a very useful insight from your perspective as well. We've only got a couple minutes left. Dave Jones has offered the following thought for everybody to think about here. I love open source tools and data sets approaches, but would also love that if those products output could be in OGC compliant service data formats so they could be accessed and shared in real time across platforms. It drives decision-making and situational awareness for people who may not understand GIS, but use it to help make decisions. I think that whole idea, excuse me, of how we connect one to another so that various insights and tools, various insights and research results can be combined using tools that will make things more accessible. Something to think about. It's something ESIP always thinks about. And I really just wanted to mention that he brought it up and suggest that we all take that away. We're just about at the break. Tom wanted to say that the WSIM tools include map servers and geo servers, WMS and WFS servers applications. So I think you were answering a little bit of that question there, Tom, I believe. And I think with that, what I'd really like to do, if it's okay with everybody else, I don't see any questions coming up, is to thank our three speakers and see if they have any closing comments that they'd like to make in the last few minutes of this session. Let's go in order. Tom? You're muted.
Thank you. It's been a great session. I hope we can continue the discussions in the virtual hallways.
Bob?
No, nothing here. Hope you attend the next session.
Yep, absolutely. And Mark, any final thoughts for us?
Thank you all for your attention. Been a good group and a lively discussion. And yeah, I think that I'm looking forward to this next session, and come check out some of the tools that Alyssa will be talking about. It'll be great.
Great. And since I'm watching the chats and other things, I can tell you that you're getting applause, clapping hands. You're getting a lot of thank yous, some thumbs up, and I'm delighted to have been a small part of this one. So thanks to all the speakers, and thanks to everyone who's been in the room. Thank you. So let's go back to Annie now.
Sure. I'm just going to remind everyone that, yeah, thanks to all. This is a really great conversation, and good to have this as like an entry point for both Tom and Mark, having never been to an ESIP meeting. I think you'll find real value in this community, especially with some of the challenges you mentioned there at the end. We kind of, what was that? I think it was Elise. I think I got her name right.
Alyssa.
Yeah. Alyssa, yeah, mentioning legacy kind of model challenges that you found the right community, and we're happy to have you and really excited to see kind of where you plug in along the way. So I think that was all great. I also just wanted to remind everyone in the Kiko chat space for this, there's a tab for this session that says 3 takeaways. It doesn't have to be just 3, but we share these after the meeting with everyone. So everyone that wasn't able to attend the session. So while we didn't have time during the session, if you had a key takeaway or something that came away for you that I would encourage, I encourage you to add that to the document. But I want to let everyone get a break in before the next round. So again, thanks to all, and see you all soon. Bye, everyone.